Hey there, I'm Ryan. Welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description. And if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon along with the reference photo for color matching. If you're interested, check it out. But with that, let's jump into it and have some fun. I'm going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush because the surface area is great for blocking in larger backgrounds, and I'm going to dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water, then wipe off the excess. This is just going to help me blend my paint farther and keep it wet for a longer period of time. With that, here we have a titanium white and a Mars black on our palette. The entirety of this painting is going to be done with those two, and then we'll add colors later via a glaze. But I'll start by grabbing some of our titanium white, and then we'll times that by about 4 in Mars black, get quite a dark mixture, but something that could still be darker, because what we're painting right now is the actual buildings in the background. And as we get closer to us, we are going to see more stark values, brighter brights, darker darks. And by ensuring that this isn't the darkest pigment that we have, we ensure that we can create some depth a little bit later on. But right now, as you can see, I'm beginning by just crafting the edges of all of these buildings, because it's much easier to do this when you have fresh paint on your brush than it is later on in the process. Now that I'm starting to run out, I'll press hard with my brush and fill in these larger areas. Through this lesson, we'll also go back and forth between being far away and close up. That way you can see some of the detail work, how I'm pressing with my brush, but also so you can see the wider details and how everything connects when it's important. With that, we'll grab some more paint, and because we have more paint, that's when, again, we want to go over to a new area that requires a sharper application, like the tops of our buildings. We'll fill that in, and then we'll work into the larger bodies yet again. Also worth noting that through this process, things are going to look a little messy in the beginning. You can see where some areas are wet, some areas are starting to dry, and that makes the application process look a little inconsistent. But that is working with acrylics. You just need to trust the process. Often, the painting ends up looking fantastic towards that 80 to 90% done period of time. And before that, it's kind of just a lot of trusting yourself. But you did see the preview, you saw the thumbnail, you know that we bring this together. So, if you find that you're struggling with some awkward stages, don't worry about it. Just keep going. You will learn, you will grow, and you will accomplish something you can be proud of by the end of this. But right now, I'm just softly moving over a lot of my application to take off any streaks. Often, when we apply more pressure, we create those, and then these softer final touches help alleviate that. And as it dries, it'll look a lot more consistent. Next, we'll paint in all of these little lights that you see through here, and we'll do so with a small liner brush. This will be fantastic for those small details we just couldn't accomplish with the larger 1-inch. As you can see, this isn't fully dry yet, but the areas that we're actually going to be painting are, so we can proceed here. Now, generally when you paint light, I think a lot of people inherently think you use the brightest pigment available. But we're not actually going to do that. We're going to take some of our titanium white, move that to a clean spot on our palette, then we'll grab maybe slightly less than an equal amount with our Mars black and mix up a mid-gray. This is going to be bright in relation to everything else, and it'll leave true brights for the foreground, which will again help us instill depth. Now when I'm applying this, I'm rotating the brush slightly so that my windows have a slight slant to them. I'm grounding my hand with my pinky finger And I'm trying to get a singular continuous stroke that I may go over a couple of times to fix up. Normally, we like to do lots of little strokes with organic subjects, but subjects like this, singular strokes make things look a lot more natural, a lot more clean and deliberate. We have another one down here with the top of a window, and then a bottom portion, and then we just have the top of another one. Just looking over at the reference photo, you can redraw this in, but I feel like you can do a pretty good job freehanding it. And we have a little row of lights down here. There we go. And we'll clean that up just so that it's a bit more structural. There we are. Okay, so from there we have a litany of windows over here to the right hand side. These ones are going to be slightly larger, so we'll actually craft that box shape. And I know the camera is fairly far away right now, but I wanted to show you where we were putting all of these in relation to each other, just so that you had that larger context. But we will be getting close for details yet again a little bit later. Here we'll do another half window before we do a complete one. You can do your edges if you fear that you are going to run out of paint that allows you to make sharp markings. And we'll skip an area. Not having full rows of windows often makes these scenes look a whole lot better. You want that variance, as it does exist. And these are getting slightly larger just because of perspective. There we go. Now we can add in more windows in those general areas a little bit later, but right now there are just a couple more rounded lights through here, one there, and we're just giving the background something a little more interesting. Over to the right hand side, we can also add a couple small subtle ones. We don't want too many over on the real sides because we don't want to draw the eye away from the center of the piece. And contrast to light will innately do that. So we're just being careful with the amount that we have. My brush is fairly watery, so I'm going over it a number of times, just getting that opacity that we want. I think we might even throw in 1, 2, right there. Another detail we can see within this area is actually the roofs in the photo. Now they aren't going to be as bright as what we have here, so I'm going to create a mixture which is kind of in between what we have there and there. It's going to be brighter than the actual buildings because snow is incredibly reflective, especially around close lights, but we also don't want it to compete too much with the actual lights. We want it to be its own distinct subject. So I'm just trying to find a mid-value there. Going to ground my hand as we do. And here can be the top of a building, this one. Can separate this and this, gives us some extra depth. And the line doesn't have to be perfectly straight on the bottom. It should be on the top, but the bottom can have snow hanging down. And that can be a nice, really organic look in a piece full of non-organic structures. Here we can have another roof. You can see I'm incorporating some little bends in the bottom. But the top, which we will work on right now, while angled this way, will be straight. You can use painter's tape or ruler to assist you if you find that really difficult. I may go back over it later when the camera isn't in the way and fix it up if I find I have any real issues, but you can also use the traceable that I'll have up over on Patreon. And that should help the process with all of the harder to achieve straight lines and just general perspective. Now I'm painting this in from the left-hand side over towards the right. Going to add more water to my brush as I continue and just have this run out essentially, dissipate. So we get the look of a roof that where the light stops existing gets darker and darker because it's no longer being lit up to such a great extent by that which is around it. Just gives us a little bit of early depth, and I think that's important. Now up here, we will add another one. And you can see that these aren't all perfectly horizontal. They have slight inclines one way or the other. That is purposeful, so that we have some depth moving forward and backward. Then we can add a second little ledge to this building. I think I can see the hint of it in the photo. Just a fun extra detail. And with these, you can also throw in added more subtle windows than what we previously had. You don't have to. They aren't in the photo, but you do have this option. Now, I'd also like to take this opportunity to note just how covered our background is with things in the foreground. We have the lampposts, we have lights, and we have snow flurries. So this is something that doesn't have to look incredible. Recognize that we are going to move over it a number of times, but that is our base. From there, we're going to start working on the foreground, which is this right here, and we'll do so with the 1 inch because it really does take up quite a bit of surface area. So this area right here, while visually complicated right now with lines, we're going to begin it by doing a very basic base layer over the entirety of it, then we'll re-interject detail on top. But this is going to be arguably the darkest area within the painting. The lampposts in the foreground will match it, but that's really it. So we're going to take quite a lot of our Mars black, hint of our titanium white, maybe 1/5, probably less. We want it to be darker than this. And we'll mix up a fair abundance of that pigment right here. Do a little check, make sure that it is in fact darker than what we have on the side. And then we'll begin by simply applying all of this. It's worth noting that the actual canvas was painted with a pure Mars black. So when this dries, it will not be as dark as the canvas. When you're painting with blacks, whites, grays, you have to recognize that what you're doing is going to be a little bit visually deceptive while it's wet, because wet paint can look much darker and much lighter depending upon how light hits it. So here I'm just going to my vanishing point in the middle. And you notice that this isn't a straight line either. We have an abundance of snow, and this is presumably on a bit of a hill. So that's why we're getting a bit of a unique look over on this side. That said, the other side has the same piece. So we'll work that in while we have this pigment fresh on our brush. Nice and easy. We have to be wary of the top, but not really the bottom, because we're going to be covering a lot of that with snow anyway. With that, probably want to do 2 layers. Let it dry. And you know what? I say that. Let's grab a little bit of titanium white, work that into our mixture, just make it a little bit brighter. Work that into the back, and blend that forward. It's going to give us some immediate depth. It was something I was going to work in later on, but I think it's just easier if we do it now. We're painting wet into wet, so the blend will be smooth, and we'll just accomplish something that'll make it look a little bit better a little bit earlier on. Now I'll be switching to the 1/3 inch Filbert brush, and this is great because it has a nice sharp top for details, but it also has rounded edges for blends. It's also not going to pick up as much paint as the 1 inch and significantly more than our liner, so great in-between brush. Now we'll take said brush and make sure that the end of it is nice and damp, and we'll start creating the snow that lines the top of this gate as well as a couple of smaller sections down towards the bottom. Now the snow here is eventually going to be very bright, but our first rendition of it is going to be not as bright. It's going to be a little bit darker so that we can build up our depth. So here I'm looking for something which is quite similar to what we have here for those backing windows. Very much a medium gray, and I'm mixing towards it, which just makes the process a whole lot easier. Always like to keep little hints of my previous mixes on the palette so I can compare them when I need to make something that's similar on the palette or on the canvas. Sometimes I do takes like this, right? Because I'm talking and I'm recording a lesson and I tend to delete them. But you know what? It's essentially a holiday lesson. We're all having fun. It's relaxed. So I think we'll keep the more silly conversation in this time. With that, use my pinky finger to ground my hand. We'll start on the very top and we'll work our way back. We want our stroke to get smaller as you work towards the back, so I'm relieving the pressure with my brush as I move there, and in the foreground I'll apply more pressure, giving us a larger application. Nice and easy, right? And I'll just do this a couple of times until I get the sizing that I really want. There we go. Grab a little bit of water, grab some additional paint. Now, there are a couple areas that can catch snow. It isn't just a gate with the side, with the top. So I'll do the same thing. Again, let it get smaller in the back. We'll do another one right below it. Just like so. And of course we lose that detail in the background, but we should. The eye can't pick up on that much detail that far away. Yet again, I'll make the top of this a little bit larger. And I don't want to make the top of this one larger because then I lose the spacing between the two. So actually just make the bottom a little bit longer. There we go. That works well. From there, we go to a brighter pigment. So we'll just grab extra titanium white, work that in. Try to keep some of the original mix on the side. That way we can remix to it later, should we want to. And we'll apply this to the tops of our new applications. We don't have to wait for them to dry. In fact, it's ideal if they are still a little bit wet. It'll allow us to do a blend from this brighter snow into darker snow, and I'm still just letting it dissipate as you move towards the back, using less and less pressure. There we are. And we can go back and add a further highlight later, but right now I'm just doing a slight blend down into the darker gray and making that nice and easy. Now, when we look at the details in this area, we can note all of these vertical pieces that overlap the applied snow that we just worked on. So we'll do that next, and we'll do so with the 1-inch flat-headed brush because it'll render a really consistent, clean, larger marking. So we'll begin by making sure that that big brush is nice and damp. Grab some paint, wipe it off. We'll grab our titanium white, mix that in a new spot. Start with an equal mixture of Mars Black, recognizing we'll probably have to darken it a little bit because we want this to be brighter than what we have here, but not actually bright. So I think that's probably a good amount. We can test it on our reference photo and we can come down. Now, this again will cover the bottom portion, like so. We'll come up with it, try to make it a singular clean stroke, because again, it's not an organic subject. And we'll have it actually protrude past the top of the snow just a little bit. Also, because we're close up, I'm pressing harder with my brush to render a bit of a more dominant line, and I can tell in the viewfinder, which makes everything look farther away, that it's actually angled more than it should be. So I'll clean that up on that side, and I'll balance it on this side. Luckily, it's the foreground and we have the opportunity to do so. It still looks a little bit tilted, but I think that's just because the canvas itself is angled backwards a little bit. But do try to get it as straight up as you can, and again, it is perfect in the traceable should you decide to use that. There we are. These are going to progressively get smaller, so I'm going to use less and less pressure. They're also getting closer and closer together. And then eventually in the background, we're overlapping them a little bit. And we're not using the entirety of the head of the brush, we're just using a small portion. So, nice and easy. We'll switch over to the Filbert. Go for the brightest variant of snow yet. So, more titanium white. Mixing it right beside our previous mixture for reference. And we'll apply this on top, assuming that it wraps around these bars which go up and then around. And then I just connect it to the rest of what we have going on here. In the background, it's more of a tapping effect because it's more nebulous and you don't want it to be that bright in the background anyway. There we go. Easy little details. And then we can add just the hint of this down here. You don't want too much of it because this area isn't going to be receiving as much light, but just having that little extra bit of detail and contrast can be really fantastic in the foreground because you will see more variance in regards to values in your details. There we go. Now we're heading over to the right to essentially redo what we did with the snow. However, this is farther away and we're not going to see the minute details and the changes. So adding the snow via the 1" will just be a bit of an easier process. So we'll start by mixing the darker snow, which I can still see a hint of on the palette. I'll mix it right beside so I have proper reference, but still try to leave it, or rather enough of it, to mix towards again in the future. There we go. I think that actually looks great. Brush is damp. I don't have too much paint on my brush. If I had a lot, I'd wipe it off, grab water, then grab this. But because we have a non-substantial amount, I think we're safe. Ground my hand with my pinky finger. And we'll create the top snowy portion over here, pressing harder with my brush as we get closer towards the edge. And you can even do a little bit of a stroke to add some level of inconsistency because the snow is much more of an organic subject. Then we have the bottom portions. That's one. You can see I'm just doing a tap towards the back end. And then we'll make the forefront a little bit larger, but not much larger because this is farther away visually from this side because we're standing in the picture closer to the left hand. And that's important to remember. So So we won't do too much here. There we go. Now we need the darker variant, or you know what? We will go for the slightly brighter snow. We don't want there to be too much contrast because it's not as close to us, but we can do a little bit. There we go. There we go. Nice and simple. Now for the areas that work vertically, we want it to be a bit darker. Not by a mile, but by a little bit. And we'll do our markings. I think this could be a bit brighter. Go over our previously applied applications. And these will quickly become very abundant because we can really see that distance. I'm only using the top area of the brush at this point because using the entirety of the head would be simply too large. There we go. And we can go back and add a second layer, build it up. Just a hint. Another little detail we can do in this area, now that it's fully dry, is round the edge of this so that this looks like it's protruding a little bit more. I'm using the liner brush because I want real access to detail. We'll grab our Mars Black, and again, not mix the darkest pigment, but very, very close to it. We want something that essentially blends into this, but it isn't a pure Mars Black. It still has a hint of titanium white. Difficult to compare with these because they're dry, and the Mars Black do look quite different when wet and dry. So we're going to trust the process. I'm going to go a couple millimeters away from the edge. And then I'll fill in that little area. A couple millimeters away from the edge, you can see there's a bit of a bend. There's a little bit of a curve. We can't do this too much because as we get farther back, it's just not realistic that we'd see that level of detail. But right here, in the foreground, can work great. And as it dries, it'll look a lot more natural. If we got the value correct. If we didn't, then we'll just go back and do another layer and it'll be okay. Nothing to worry about. It's one of the real wonderful parts about acrylics. They are so forgiving. If you mess up, if you don't like something, that's okay. Let it dry for 5-10 minutes, go back, paint over it. Just such an accessible medium. Now, while I'd like to start painting the snow and all of those beautiful little details, textures, and changes in value, first we have to paint almost everything the snow lands on top of, which includes this little protruding piece right here and the one on the other side. It's going to be very dark. We'll use the 1 inch, and it'll be nice and easy. Then we'll jump into the really fun part. So these bottom portions here are going to be quite dark, probably in a very similar vein to that. So we'll grab a lot of Mars Black, a little bit of titanium white, make sure our brush is nice and damp so that we can really extend this pigment. We'll apply that there, have it run up this way. And by the time this dries, it'll probably look quite similar to what we have in the background, the unfinished area, but I wanted to do this anyway, just to ensure that we didn't have that pure Mars Black in any portion of the painting. And if it's a little bit too wide at the ends, that really is okay because we're painting over most of it, the real majority, with snow in just a minute anyway. So it really isn't a concern. If anything, you can make this wider than you think it should be, and then just work reductively. And that's what I'm doing here. Just makes for a more relaxed painting process. There we go. Yeah, you can really see how wide that ended up getting. That's okay. We will wait for this to dry though, because we don't want our snow pigments blending with it. We want the snow sitting on top. So we'll do that, and then we'll be back together working on something really fun. For the snow here, we'll use a couple of different brushes. The 1-inch for this larger portion here in the middle. We'll use the Filbert for the details and the little divots within the snow, as well as the details that lead up to our larger fence. And then we'll also use a brand new brush for the shimmering effect that you can kind of see down here for those really minute details, but I'll show you that one in a little bit. We'll start by doing the larger, greater mix for the snow with the 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we'll grab really large amount of said titanium white. We'll grab about half that in our Mars black, and we'll mix up what should be fairly equal to the mid value that we had previously for our snow. We have a good amount of it. Take as much off of the brush as we possibly can, and we'll switch over to the Filbert, where we'll grab some, and then over on the side here, we'll start working some snow up and around the vertical posts that we have. So you can see that I'm working horizontally until I find one of those, and then I'll create a little divot, a little space for it. And as we get farther back, that'll become less apparent, because again, it'll just be small to the point where we won't see that detail. And then we'll extend it predominantly horizontally, but with a little bit of a swoop so that it still works within the larger motion. And we'll bring this essentially towards the edge, where it'll essentially stop. Working around that, leaving quite a bit of it semi-transparent intentionally. That way it looks like there's some higher areas and some lower areas that just aren't receiving that same amount of light. We will also do the same over here on the right hand side. Here we can't really see the posts anymore just because they've been painted over almost in their entirety. So we'll just redraw those in after and work it around the snow. But here again, I essentially want to go until there's an imaginary little lip, and then we'll have the snow meet it down here, essentially. But the snow down here is going to be a bit different, and we'll start rendering it with the 1-inch flat-headed brush because we have a lot of space to cover. So here, there will be some pockets of a mid-bright value of our snow, and then there will be some pockets of really bright snow. And that's essentially happening because of the light shining down, and then it's going to catch this area. And it looks very long rather than being tall as well, because perspective, the way we see it, it actually is quite long. It just doesn't visually look that way because of our angle. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the in-between areas of underneath these with this, and then we'll do a brighter variant for the ones that are directly under. So for that, we'll take what we currently have on our brush, grab a lot of titanium white. This will be the brightest mixture yet, and I'll essentially add 2/3 of what we were working with in titanium white. There we go. And now I'm going to start applying this down here on the bottom. Going to use lots of little strokes. Eventually that will be noticeable. Right now it isn't, but that's okay. But we do lots of strokes because eventually we want mounds of snow, and that'll make it look really dynamic and interesting. Now I'm skipping quite a bit of space because we are going to have our next post right there. And as we get farther back, it's going to start connecting, just because, again, visually they're going to look closer and closer together the farther back it is. That said, this also exists on this side, and it's slightly less prominent visually. It's going to look messy for a little while. Don't worry about that. We will clean it all up. That said, now we'll go back, grab our darker variant. You know what? I think we can go a little bit darker than that. I do want a fair amount of variance here. There we go. And I'm making this darker because it's going to blend with the brighter pigments. And therefore it is going to brighten up. So here we go, starting to blend into that. Looking messy, as it's meant to at this point. It's just a base layer. Just getting our general values in here. And that's okay. It's not the most thick layer of paint either. We can still see some of the canvas showing through. And of course, we need to go to those edges. We can still see hints of the highlight, which is important. So I know where to apply it with a proper layer in a little bit. And I'll also do a bit more of a proper edge. Not necessarily a sharp one, but a defined one. Here. Down at the bottom, we'll create that so it has more dimension. Grab a bit more water because it's getting a bit chalky to work with. It'll make the application a bit more semi-transparent as we start to run out of paint, but that's okay because we want this bottom area to be a bit darker. And as you can see, as I run out of that actual paint, my application gets thinner, we see more of that dark base showing through, and we get that natural effect. That said, again, looks a bit messy. So let's grab more of that light pigment, work that back over this, and we'll blend that out with a damp brush. That way, if the darker grays aren't still wet, it's okay because we'll get a wet onto dry blend, where the pigment essentially just over time becomes more and more transparent. I think I have too much paint to blend that out, so I'm going to start reapplying it elsewhere. There we go. And now I'll take the remainder of my paint off, and with the damp brush we'll go in for those slight blends, trying to make the tops and the bottoms nice and soft on both sides. Still not going to look great. Definitely need more layering, more fine tuning, but we are starting to see the form. That's important. I'm also using essentially just water and whatever little bit of paint I can pick up. I'm going to work over this back area. That way we can get a little bit of a flurry effect. It'll help our silhouette stand out. It'll give us some extra depth. Being very soft with my brush, I'm bringing it up. This is an important step. There we go. Very watery application. Really like that. Okay. So from there, we are going to switch to our Filbert And this is how we'll start working some detail on. So get you a little bit closer and ensure you can see the bottom of the canvas. So this is essentially where we start fine-tuning things and add a little bit more dimension to our application. And doing the application process here with this brush will help us achieve that really greatly. You can see that I'm making a lot of really small strokes that are noticeable to a point. They're not heavily dramatic, but they are distinctive. You can see that I'll make the stroke in an area I shouldn't, just so you can really see the application. I start soft, I apply more pressure, there's a little bit of an arc, a little bit of a bend, and then I relieve pressure. So you get something that looks like it has a highlight on the top, the most protruding area. So the area that's lifted the most, the area that can catch the most light, is going to get that highlight to the greatest degree. And we do this so that we can create those little mounds. This is going to make the snow look a little bit thicker, a little bit deeper. And we also connect said mounds to create more intricate areas. This is technically achievable with the larger brush, but it's a lot easier doing it this way, and it gives us more control. There we go. And again, we want to lead it all right back here. This is where the light is really coming from, this edge. If you need to clean up this back area later, you can do that. I will probably be doing so. And we'll also be adding highlights to the edges, as we will need them to match. That said, I'll also grab the darker pigment, and I'll have that meet in the middle of these with that same application. Every time we apply a layer, it should look a little bit more professional. Often, snow looks a little cartoony or a little unprofessional when we just don't have enough layers. So we just continuously build it up with our brush, create that variance, create that very slight amount of movement. There we go. We can cut into our previous snow with this to create different layers. Now you can see this area looks like an area that falls in, and then this is an area that, again, pops out. I'll have to cover that up, but I'll also create an even darker mix for as we get closer to the foreground. And we do that just because there's less reflective light going around, brightening up the scene. So we have a greater contrast. Typically, your foregrounds in all paintings, or most rather, not all, most. There are exceptions to almost every rule. Typically, they're a little bit more saturated and a little bit more of a high contrast, a high value range, just because you don't have all of that reflective light distorting the innate coloring values and contrast in the foreground like you do the background. So here, doing a lot of the foreground with these darker pigments, but we do have some catching up to do because everything else has more layers. That said, we want an in-between pigment between our dark and our light. A bit more of a transition area between the two. Definitely going to want more brights on top of this now, but I think that worked well. Being relatively soft with this as I'm using it as a transitionary pigment. And sometimes I go back with these transitionary pigments and I apply them to the bottoms of these mounds, but not the tops, because when the top is sharper, it makes it look like it's higher and then it has a dip down. And we can re-accomplish that very simply like this, by going back with that highlight, doing a little bit of a blend down, but not a blend up. And now it looks like that has a higher area. It's not what I actually want right here though. Just wanted to do that as a quick little example for you. You want some of them to be higher, some of them to be lower. And this one I want to be a bit more flat. That way the entry into the painting is more inviting and it doesn't look like a challenge to do the actual walk-in adventure, right? Little subconscious things to think about, but all of those little ideas do add up. I always want the viewer to feel like it'll be a relaxed entry, and then they can kind of get lost and have fun in the details in the background. Though that is a personal mission, not something you have to take on. You can have your art directed in a different way, should you want it. I think I'll take a couple of steps back to see how this is all really progressing, because realistically, we don't know until we are a bit farther away and we have that real context. So, we'll do exactly that. So, stepping back, I realize I do like the progression. This area is a bit more detailed in regards to brushstroke than the actual reference photo, but I like that it just gives, again, the snow a little bit more volume than what it has there. And with that, I'm also going to take some of those extra highlights, hint of the medium. We do want something bright, we just want it to be slightly less bright. And I'm going to tap on, with a little bit of a drag, some extra smaller details that we haven't really attempted right here in the foreground, coming out from this one larger area. And this light is hypothetically still coming from this source, same as that, but these are the areas that are now getting a little bit farther away, and so only the real tops are catching that light. It's not working its way in through the crevices like it can there, because it's just not as close. And this is a little bit of a detail that I do see in the reference photo and I like. You can also do a bit of a tapping effect, but we're going to get a real shimmer using a different brush. Also remember, we're going to have falling snow on top of just about all of this, and that'll also add detail, so don't feel like you need to overdo it at this step. Again, a lot of this comes together later in the process, and right now we're having fun and setting up those foundations. There we are. Really like how this is coming along though. I think it has a lot of promise. Also, before we get to the real highlights down there, I do want to take this highlight and I want to work it up onto here in the areas where it is most prevalent. And I also want to work it on the tops of a lot of these. I think at this point with this height, it'll essentially stretch all the way through, but maybe also have some smaller little highlights down here at the bottom. Not too many, but we can also add to these later. It is just an important part for creating the larger piece. Now for the first time we'll be switching to a fairly stiff bristled fan brush, and this is fantastic because all of these little pieces at the end will render individual pieces of snow and create a really nice randomized effect in a semi-linear fashion. So we'll grab some paint. We won't wet this one because we don't want our bristles condensing. We want them to be nice and rough at the end, and we'll apply some details to our snow. The first step is to take our 1-inch brush, grab some titanium white, and brighten up our previously brightest area, because we want this to be the shine, the shimmer that is happening on some very select little pieces. And I'm also thinning it out so that I don't get too much on the bristles, making them difficult to work with, or again, just condense. So I'll put that brush down. We'll grab our fan brush, get it just on the ends, head into the areas that we are going to have the most light on, therefore the most opportunity to have a shine. We'll work our way out. I'm rotating my brush slightly, putting on different angles, and this is going to look very subtle initially, but it can and will build up semi-dramatically. So, would recommend being careful with it. We're not going to do too much out farther past here just because it is a real detail, and eventually those details should get lost. The eye again just can't manage to recognize that from an afar. There we go. Starting with minor amounts, building it up on all of these tiny little pieces which protrude and catch light. Lots of rotating for the edge. Grab it for out here and this side, just for the front. There we go. I would assume there's still quite a bit to do, but I'm quite close to the canvas, and when you are this close, it's really difficult to kind of look at the painting as a whole and make those decisions. So, once I'm semi-comfortable, I'm going to take a couple steps back and really look at the painting. This area as a whole definitely needs more. Because we have such a high contrast, I want more slight highlights in the shadows. There we go. Through this we can even connect previously open areas. Probably seems quite repetitive, but it does get to be a rather cathartic application process. You're familiar, you're comfortable, you're working simply with the addition. There we are. Again, I'll take a couple of steps back, and we'll continue to reevaluate. So after further examination, I realized that I liked it a lot right here, but it didn't feel like it fit the rest of the painting. And I know I want to extend it to here, I want to extend it to here, I want to extend it partially in between. So I thought I'd get us closer for some detail work, as you've seen the wider shot to a fairly good extent. So I'm going to get the majority of this first application off in pre-established areas, just filling out spots that I know I want to be filled out, because I don't want to add too much paint this far away early on. I want to have the opportunity to build it up. So here we go, working in that middle area with having a couple working in between. That way it all still feels like the same subject And I think that was the larger issue I was having with it earlier. There we go. We have that come down here, and now it even seems more natural down here, so we can do more of it. You can see I have almost nothing left on my brush when I make these applications. I'm really not doing a whole lot, but I like that at this point, especially in this area where I was initially hesitant to apply it. There we go. Everything's becoming less visually distinctive, but I do think that's actually aiding the painting. Sometimes simple and simplified subjects aren't a bad thing at all. I think often that's one of the larger hurdles painters have to kind of get over after that intermediate stage. Kind of recognizing that while you have the talent to add a lot of detail and to differentiate and to really get creative with it, in a lot of scenarios you need to simplify subjects so that other subjects can pop more, and so that you can have a very cohesive, well-flowing painting. Do a little bit back here, but really not much at all. And we'll take those steps back yet again. Now, stepping back, I really like where it's going, and I think that it's quite successful, but in our raising of the snow and the levels of it, we essentially lost what would have been a sidewalk. And you can see it very faintly right here in the snow. So, we're going to reincorporate that using the fan brush and the pigment that we were using for the darker areas of this. And with that, I'm actually just going to very simply tap on a little area of what is essentially shadow from the drop of a covered sidewalk. It's going to get smaller as we get towards the back. There we go. You can soften it and blend it with your finger, but we want to incorporate some level of texture, as you can see, and it'll just make it so that it feels like this area protrudes and then drops back down. You can do it slightly over here as well. It's not something I want a lot of because, again, I do want this to seem a little bit taller, the snow at least, than in the photo. There we go. Yeah, not much of it. But something else we have to do when we commit to that is moving our snow just a little bit farther back, the highlights, in the area of the walkway. So for that, I'll go back to the Filbert, make it a little bit damp, grab the highlight, and then here you can see that continuous line. We just need to assume that that line comes to that shadow, and then we go upwards, right? Just following three-dimensional space, and then we move this way. So it means we need to create a little bit of have a tapped highlight a little bit higher up, and then we can extend the notable area on the bottom. This is a very little added technique, but it will give it slightly more dimension than what it had. And we'll just do that with the first two, because they're the only ones large enough where it would be even semi-noticeable. So we're going with a horizontal line, we drop down, and then wherever we land on that drop, we continue that line out. Might not even notice it on camera. Very, very subtle, but I like it. And we can also mix a slightly darker variant of what we were using for the shadows. And we can reincorporate that just in this front area. There we go. Okay, so that's one more nice little incorporation. Let's start a bit of a larger step. So while I'd love for the next step to be all of our lights, that's actually I think my favorite part of this and what really drew me to the piece, we need to paint the actual sky first so that we can paint that on top of it. So we have a large surface area, which means we're moving back to the 1-inch flat-headed brush, and the sky at the bottom has a bit of light because the city itself is generating it. We lose that light as we move up towards the top and the right and left hand corners. So what we're looking to do is create a gray for this, which is brighter actually a little bit than the buildings, but darker than anything we have in the snow. So we don't actually have that much of a range, which is great because it makes it easy to find. So I'll start by grabbing quite a lot of titanium white because we are mixing for a very large area. Grab about an equal mixture of our Mars black. Work those two together. And we know it needs to be darker than our snow, so it needs to be darker than this mixture right here. So I'll grab about 1/3 more Mars black. Work that in there. Holding my palette on a bit of an angle so that I don't get too much of a reflection, distorting the color, or rather the value. We aren't actually working with any colors technically, just, you know, our Mars black and our titanium white. I think that's good. I'll do a little test on my reference photo. And that's actually brilliant. That's just what we're looking for. Love it. That is, if it works well with these, because we may have changed our value on these, which may change the value we're looking to compare with. But we'll give it a try. We'll give it a shot. We'll work it along the top of our buildings, just like so. If I don't end up liking this, it's not a big fix. Won't take too long. Following my old rule of working the edges first, making those as nice and clean as we can before working in larger bodies space. We are going to paint over the majority of our light posts, but I'll try to leave just a hint of where this one is, because I really like it where it is in 3D space. We can separate our buildings just a little bit there. And then once we have our edges, as you know, we start to work up and in. This is quite bright. Really what I wanted, I do believe. Take a step back. I'm going to look at it in relation to my snow. I think it's still what we want, especially considering we're going to put a much darker pigment on top and blend down. So we'll keep blending this out. Work it around here. Again, just going to keep a hint of this. So covering the majority of it so that I can blend properly with my current pigment. And I'm going to try to get my next darker color on before this all dries so I can blend a wet into wet. Just make life a little bit easier. It isn't necessary, but would be nice. So now I'll grab essentially an equal amount of black as I have currently wet paint on the palette. keep a hint of the initial color over to the right, just in case I want to remix it. We'll apply this to the top, just like so. I am grabbing water in between my applications to help keep the paint wet and help us drag it out farther. There we are. And it's going to look very messy until we get to that blending and softening process, but we are just about there. So now I'm going over both much more softly to eliminate some of those brush strokes which we rendered in the initial applications. Blending vertically to a point, bringing that pigment back down. You can see we're losing quite a lot of our light, but that's okay. Starting to look a lot better. Let's get an even darker mix. A little bit of extra titanium white. There we go. Apply that at the top. Still wet. And I know my hand's probably in the way for quite a bit of this, and I do apologize. Really is just one of those things I'm trying to be a bit more hasty with. And due to that, I can't be as mindful of my brush positioning. There we are. You can hear the easel winding back and forth despite the fact that I'm using minimal amount of pressure. But it's looking good. Grab more of that pigment. And I'm just slowly moving it down, lessening the amount of highlight that we have in the sky, but never by a grand amount. You don't want to use too much water, otherwise you can make an area difficult to apply paint to. So I'm just doing a little bit each time. Still losing portions of this, but I can still lightly see where it is, which is nice. And from there, I think at this point we let it dry, because it'll probably dry a little bit darker, and I don't want to overdo this process of darkening it. We can also darken it with a bit of a glaze in a little bit. So at this point we give that a good 10 minutes to dry because we used a lot of water. Typically the more water you use, just to be safe, you give it a little bit of extra dry time. So we'll do that, and then I'll either do a glaze darkening it, I'll show you how to do that, or we'll draw this back in and we can start on some other fun pieces. Now, it's been about 10 minutes, the sky is fully dry to the touch, and I think it dried a little bit brighter than what I wanted. So, we're going to take the 1-inch flat-headed brush, make sure it is nice and damp, grab a little bit of Mars Black, the smallest tint of titanium white, and this will be the darkest mixture we've made yet. We'll try to spread it out well here on our palette, then we'll go back to our water, grab a lot more water, incorporate that in there. And now, as you can probably see, it's a lot like watercolor. It's very, very thin. It drips to a point, and this will be great for creating a glaze. So this will modify the value slightly as we start coming down. There's a very thin first layer. We'll go in and create a second. And this is often just a really good way of enhancing your gradients, should you need to. We'll also use it later to create the color in the painting. But for now, we will get a different use out of it. I'm going over it numerous times until it dries, And this is how we avoid any notable brush strokes. Though I actually wouldn't dislike brush strokes in this one, just because it's a snowy scene and it would kind of look like little flurries if we did have brush strokes. So, you know what, maybe I'll press a little bit harder in the final renditions here and we'll actually add some. Just to show you what it could look like. And I'm bringing this down over the building slightly. Going back up. And we'll just repeat this a couple of times. If you want it to be significantly darker, then you'll probably want to let it dry fully. And then go back in with another glaze until you're happy with it. Now we are finally going to get to add in our light posts, or at least the darker silhouette of them. Something else we could do is the power lines. I'm still not sure if I want them in the lesson yet though, so we'll see what happens there, but we will start working on one of the really fun. Now this first post here is quite large, so I will be using the 1-inch flat-headed brush and just using that sharper edge to craft my way down. But I do want to make sure the brush is nice and damp so that I do get that nice clean long stroke. We'll grab a lot of Mars Black, maybe 1/12 that titanium white. This is really arguably the darkest dark within the lesson, with the exception of maybe what we have right there. So we'll mix up a good amount of it, but we don't want too much on the brush. So we'll take off our excess. Grab some extra. I'm going to put down my palette and we'll do something new here. Grabbing my ruler, putting the top of it on the top of my canvas just to make sure that it's nice and straight. And I'm going to craft the line for the right hand side. Starting at the top right before the bend. Nice and steady. I'll have to go back and fix up the bottom just a little bit, but it's a good beginning. Moving this over a couple millimeters, grabbing more paint. There we go. Want to make sure it's just right, so we're taking our time. There we go. Again, we'll have to fix the bottom. So I'll do that, or at least begin doing that here. Though I'll probably want to use a liner brush to do it really efficiently. That I like though. Great movement. Nice and clean. We won't have to do this with all of them, but for the most prominent ones in the foreground, I definitely advise it. Here I am attempting to use this brush to clean up that bottom area. But we are going to want to add some snow and light to this anyway. So that worked out well. Show you it over on the right hand side. You know what? We still have quite a bit of paint on here. We can take it off, and we should take it off before we begin. So I'm just wiping it on some painting cloth. There we go. Grab more paint. Going to go over on this side so that I don't accidentally move the wet paint that we have on that. Just lining the ruler up with the top so we have a nice straight application. Again, we take our time here. There we go. You can see that typically these end up being a little bit smaller on the top and then they get wider as you move towards the bottom, just because I lose pressure with the ruler and this has room to move. But I like that, though this is farther away than this, and I don't think we should have them be that dark as we move into the background, because again, we just have more of that snow light covering that area. So I'll do it with this pigment exclusively for the next one on the left hand side, and then we'll move to a brighter pigment. Just getting this correct. I know, not the most fast-paced, engaging painting process, but one that will lead you to more success. There we go. Also, nice and clean. A little bit smaller as well because we're moving farther into the distance. Now going to put the ruler down, and we are going to be brave and freehand the next one. There we are. Already broke my rule. Said I was going to change the pigment. I think it worked out fine, but as we proceed, I will interject slightly more titanium white into our mix. Yet again. Also, I do apologize if my arm or hand was in the way for any part of that. It's really one of those things where we just need to focus, and sometimes, unfortunately, that focus is not on the camera. It's on getting that line as straight as possible. This next one over here could arguably be done with a ruler. It's long enough. There we go. I feel like I might have brought that down slightly more than I wanted to, and we can easily remedy that with snow a little bit later on. There we go. As you move farther into the distance, these should get a little bit closer just because of perspective. We'll also make it a little bit brighter. And if you progressively make all of them a little bit brighter, it'll flow really, really nicely. You don't have to, but it is a good little detail, should you want to. There we are. These are kind of getting lost in the distance, and this area will be full of light. From there, we'll get a little bit closer, switch over to the liner brush, grab that darker pigment that we used for the foreground, and we'll do two things. One, we'll fix the bottom, make it a little bit rounded, but two, I want to have a piece of this sticking out on both the left and the right hand side. I want it to look like the area on top kind of sits in a smaller cylindrical piece. It's an extra little detail. We don't have to incorporate, but I think it makes the subject look a bit more natural, unique. There we go. We won't do it for all of them because they quickly become too small in the background, but do it for a couple. There we go. Brilliant. And we of course have to do it to the other side. Much easier over there because they're smaller. Now up to the top, grabbing that same dark pigment, and we will freehand the nice bend that we have up here. Again, this is all pre-drawn in the traceable, if you find this a little bit difficult. But as you can see, I am making it work. So if you have a bit of a background with drawing and sketching, you can probably do a pretty nice job. Lots of focusing here. A little less talkative. I start by making my lines smaller, and then I expand outwards. It's easier to add pigment than it is to subtract it. That's why I'm going about it in the way that I am there. Now here, taking some artistic liberties, just changing the shape minorly. And then the light can sit right under this, giving it a slightly rounded bottom for the light to sit in it. Once I have those edges, we fill it in. Now, as you know, this has to be done a number of times here. That's okay. Realistically, probably get a little bit quicker at it each time. We'll get a little bit better at it each time. And the next time we go to paint anything with a little bit of architecture, we can remember this and say, you know what? I can do that. There's a lot of those very definitive lines, something we're not really all that used to working with in landscapes, right? Everything's so natural, you can kind of play with them and bend the original shapes to a rather great degree. Here we're going to make this a little bit brighter. But here, we're very much locked in to the pre-existing shapes and the constraints that those create. Not that they're bad constraints. Perhaps guidelines is a better word. Let's head over to the right hand side. So yet again, working with some pretty small subjects, trying to apply as little pressure as possible. If you find it difficult with this brush, you could switch to a smaller liner brush. This one's a little bit large, just so that I can fill in the bodies with relative ease. And it's working, but it can be a little bit difficult to maneuver on the tops of these smaller ones. And these should get smaller as we move towards the center. The light posts themselves should get shorter. This is the last one with this mix, and then I will add some extra titanium white. There we go. Not bright, but brighter than what we were working with, and something that will blend in with the background to a point, which isn't actually a bad thing here at all. There we go. So here we have a little bit of a wider shot, and we do have our silhouettes down and dry. The next step is to add the reflective light that's going to be coming from the actual lights onto these. So I will be using the liner brush for it. We'll be grabbing some titanium white, Mars black, mixing up something that's notably brighter than what we were previously working with. So I'm mixing on top of the previous mixture, making more of a mid-gray. I'm going to start it slightly higher than the light post. That way it looks like the light's hitting it and working its way up just a little bit. Going to work my way down in a number of strokes. And I'm doing it this way rather than doing a singular stroke, just in case there was a noticeably large bend in my application that I didn't want. This just allows us to keep it a bit more fine-tuned, but of course it comes at the cost of a slightly textured aesthetic. You can see the brush strokes to a point, but I'm okay with that because it's light moving off metal that might not be perfect, right? Now, I'm also working my way back with these applications very softly, so I get a little bit of a blend, and I'm also working softly when I get towards the top and the bottom. So really, this middle portion that's facing the light is the most opaque, and then it gets softer, softer, softer. That said, we'll take this and we'll head it down here. Again, nice and easy. Won't stop there. We'll continue all the way into the back and on the other side. You can see that it does get a lot quicker as you move into the smaller ones. There we are. From there though, we do need to brighten some of these, and I'll get you a bit closer for the technique. Now, we will wet our brush, grab some additional titanium white paint, work that into our mixture, and venture farther into our highlights. So this, I'm actually going to start a little bit farther down than our last application. Put it on that right hand side. Try to create as straight of a line as I can. And then I'll blend it back just a little bit. So I'm working a little bit more to the left, less pressure, less paint on the brush. And this is how we're slowly going to build up our highlights. So more water on my brush, especially as I get farther back because these are smaller markings I need to make. And the water will condense the bristles and make that easier for me. You can also blend it with our finger a little bit. There we go. There we go. Might want to switch to a smaller liner brush as you get towards the back here, unless you feel like you have a lot of control. And with that, one more time, we'll add some extra titanium white. Come back to that middle portion, this time starting even farther down and ending even earlier. A little quiet as it is very detail oriented. And it's still not the brightest pigment, as we did want to save that for the actual lights themselves, which will be in this general shape. This actually isn't a bad pigment to get them started with either. We will be brightening it up though. There we go. Drawn in, nice and easy. Didn't even intend to be on this step yet. We'll render the glow effect a little bit differently, but you can start by just softening your edges with very light tap and drag effects, and working that out as you run out of paint with your brush. Though a very watery brush will accomplish this a lot better, and we can do that a little bit later. That said, before we get ahead of ourselves, we'll go back to the mid-gray, so not the brightest, newest rendition, but the one right before that. And we will interject that right in here. It's okay if it comes off the pole a little bit, as it'll look like the light's just reflecting off into the flurries of snow, which we are yet to paint. We're also more subtle on this side because they're a bit farther away, and we are going to have those subjects and light in between. Now we'll take that step back and we'll create that semi-bright but also mid-gray that we used in our first light, something we can build on top of. And we'll incorporate that into more of our posts. It's another one of those things that'll just get quicker and easier, which is nice. But we are going to go back to this a number of times with brighter pigments and ones that softly move light outwards. Just creating a base right now. Just double checking my spacing. We also still need to add some people into the background. That'll be fun. And I'm just throwing in a couple extra lights. There we go. Something else we might want to do is make a slightly darker variant of that. We can add a little bit of a highlight around the bottom of these. Small but effective. Just showing that light working its way down. And we can also do a little bit of a tap. Might extend this. Not too far, but softly a little bit. Just make it notably three-dimensional. There we go. From there, we'll get extra close, grab that liner brush, and mix up a pigment that's brighter than anything we've previously worked with. So I'll work beside our bright pigments. We'll still grab a hint of Mars Black so that we do always have room to brighten slightly, but we are going for the brightest yet. Now I don't want much pigment on my brush, so I'm going to take off the excess, make sure that it's nice and damp, and we just want a smaller amount because it's going to offer us more control in this process. So I'm going to begin by working my way around some of the edges. I like the top middle because that's where the light's actually coming from, and then I like working my way around the edge because the light is stretching and wrapping around, and then there's also some connective portions in the middle that are also going to get some extra light. Though we're leaving slightly darker areas as well, as that will give us some depth within it. Now, we can still see that in the viewfinder, good. We'll come down here, and we'll start applying this. As we get farther and farther back, we will lose the ability to add such detail. That's okay. I'm going to go back up here, now that it's starting to dry. Do another layer. And we do multiple layers because the first time we add it, we're essentially getting a combination of this bright pigment and the pigment that's underneath because acrylics are semi-transparent. But now we're adding a highlight on top of a highlight, so we're mixing essentially an almost white with an almost white, which makes it a lot brighter over time, especially as it dries. So do remember those extra layers. We are going to do a bit of a glow, but we're going to first let all of it dry. In the meantime, we can add a little bit more of a highlight right in the middle there. It's nice, not too much, but we'll head down and get the other lights. So here we have plenty of opportunity to continue. And as noted, we've essentially already run out of space to do the detail work. So we're just filling in that general spot, maybe a little highlight along our edges. Head over to the right hand side where we can do some detail. There we go. There's a slight drilling sound in the background. Apologies if you can hear that. It's still fairly early in the morning. Kind of surprising. But that's okay. There we are. Lots of lights in the background. Just going to tap them a little bit. That's going to thin the paint and make it look like it's getting lost in the distance. It'll also disrupt its general form, which will aid us in that as well. We can also brighten up some of our other lights, should we want to. Doesn't have to be all of them, doesn't have to be any of them, but if you feel like you just want more detail in an area, now's a great time to add it. That said, we do need people down here and we need some additional glowing. So we'll pull the camera back, we'll do a bit of the glow, we'll do the people, and then we'll continue with the following steps. Now that we've given our lights a little bit of time to dry, we are going to use that same liner brush and yet again create a nice bright mixture, very similar to the last one, where it does have a hint of Mars Black, but in comparison to everything else, it's essentially the brightest pigment we have. And then I'm going to make sure my brush is nice and damp because we really want to move around the paint that we're about to apply. So I'll start by applying the paint that I want to move out just towards the edge that we have here. I'll do it to this one, and I'll do it to this one. I'm going to do 3 at a time just so that I got the excess paint off my brush, and it'll make our life easy. Now I'm going to hold my brush like this and rotate my brush in miniature circles, taking that paint from the edge of the light and blending it out. There we are. The more water you have, the more semi-transparent the edge can and will be. I'm just going to grab more water right now. Make sure that we get that paint in between all of the canvas tooth. And we'll continue working our way out. For the most part, we're keeping it under the actual lamp. And And now we'll go to this side, trying to get a relatively soft transition. Though, because again, we are painting with what will be a bit of a snowstorm, we can leave in some applications, some of the line work. You can also blend with your finger if you, like me, never left that in preschool. I always make that joke, but it's honestly such a useful technique in so many scenarios. You do need to make sure that your fingers are very, very clean when you go ahead and do it though. Otherwise the oils from your fingers can make the canvas difficult to apply paint, and especially wet paint too. So, something to consider. I did wash my hands before I started this step. Now at this point the pigment here probably dried, so I went back and grabbed a little bit more, and while we're at it, I'll just reapply to a lot of these because they could be brighter and we might get to them. Doing this with the smaller areas will be a lot easier. So now we'll take off all of that pigment and we'll work our way out. You can do this multiple times through multiple layers, so you don't have to make it grand or that glow wildly expansive on your first attempt. This is something we can build up, and that's how I intend to do it. It's just a safer way of applying that pigment. And it's time to grab a little bit more. Getting a little bit closer to us, so a little bit larger. There we are. And we need one for right there as well. Really enjoying this. Love the effect. Love the act of putting it on. It's all a lot of fun. Really building these up. In the process, you will brighten the actual light because we are adding a lighter value on top of the general area. There we go. That's great for atmosphere. Lots of light in the reference photo. Moving out from that area. Of course, you don't have to make them this dramatic, but I'm definitely a fan. And I think it could even be more so. There we are. Have a lot of paint on the brush, which is something you don't want through this process. But you can see that I'm really just bouncing back and forth as I let them dry. There we are. We can also go back and add more once you've added snow. And that is something I'm considering. I'm not going to add too much. Not too much more anyway. Not until we have other elements. And then once we have set other elements, we'll have a better idea of just how much we need here. There we go. Now we'll quickly jump down towards the middle area, and in the reference photo there are actually 4 figures. I'm only going to paint 2, just make it a little bit more intimate. We'll go with a medium to dark black or gray. We don't actually want it to be a black because we don't want it to stand out to a great degree. This might be actually a little bit too bright, but I'd rather falter on that side and then have to make it darker. And we're just going to go with the general silhouette of 2 people walking. Nothing wildly complicated here. Again, this is in the traceable if you need it. There we are. Not a distinctive form, but I don't think that's necessary. They have the implication of all of the structure. There we go. And because they are done with a value that's softer than this, they look quite far back, which I like a lot. And you know what? Let's make a much brighter version. And we can do additional smaller people in the back there. That's a little bit too bright. Mix more with the Mars black. A little bit more of that darker pigment. There we go. I like that. It has life, but it's also not crowded. It's cozy. It's a lot of good things. Now we'll have some fun applying the snow, and we'll do so yet again with our liner brush. Going to make sure that it's nice and wet. We'll grab some of our titanium white and remix that color that we used for the highlight. Again, not a pure white, still has a hint of that Mars black. And we'll get quite a bit of it because we will need a fair amount for our snow. But this is all much too thick. I want really thin pigment, semi-transparent pigment, pigment that moves easily. So I'm going to take all of that pigment off my brush. I'm going to add a lot of water to my brush. Add that water to our current mixture. Go back, grab more water. Add it to our mixture. Go back, grab more water. It's in our mixture, and that consistency should be quite good. Now I'm going to just open up my easel so I can put my palette down. I'm going to take my brush, hold it vertically, peel back my bristles, and we will simply launch some of our snow at the canvas. Though, it's not really going to be this simple for all of it. We're just going to get a general base amount, and then I'll show you how to be a bit more targeted and get this where we really want it. Because there is a spot which will really make the painting look great. That said, first we will get the general down. Rotating the brush a little bit as you do have some control. Oh, 1 second. Apologies there, quick little phone call from FedEx, but with that we are going to get closer. I'm going to show you how we can be a bit more targeted with our applications. So when I want a wider area to kind of apply this, I hold the brush a lot farther back, and I generally hold the brush vertically to get that spread. However, we can go a lot closer and we can work on angles to work it in much more specific areas. And you can get a bit more of a linear effect. And I'm trying to get this right under our more prominent lamp because we're going to see a lot more snow directly under it. Same goes for this one. So really close. And I would recommend trying this on another canvas first, just because you can render actual lines and you don't really want to do that. Can take a little bit of practice, but once you get it, it's great. You can also go in, as you can see, and paint on individual little pieces of snow. And I'll use my finger to soften a couple of them. This is going to make their edges less dominant. And it's not that there's more snow around the light, it's just that it's more visible, right? We can see significantly more in its vicinity because it's brightening it. It's getting it an opportunity to shine. And we are just ensuring that we can capture that magic here on the painting. Do that with these. And because there's a row of them, we can hold our brush like this, and if we get the right angle, we can get all of them at once. Though you can see that I got quite a lot of it out here. I'm going to soften it using my finger. Generally a little tap will do better than an actual drag. That way you don't end up with line work. And slowly building up all of these, jumping from area to area, that way they're balanced. There we go. Also moving around. The tap effects that we're creating right now are going to render larger markings than what we're able to get when we peel back the bristles. So it's all about finding that balance. And again, you want some of your snow to have a sharper aesthetic, so just a marking made with a brush, and other snow you want to soften with your finger to give it a bit more of a dynamic movement. Make it look a little bit farther away too. And that you can drag if you want the snow to look like it is blowing in the wind. The amount of snow that you incorporate, again, is very much up to you. I'm a big fan of snow. We do live in Ontario, Canada. Had quite the snowfall this week, actually. I'm feeling very inspired. There we go. Beautiful. Oh, I love that. Okay. Now, the reference photo does have some cable lines up here, which I'm opting not to incorporate in our version, as well as some tree branches that kind of swoop in from the left. Again, not incorporating them just because I don't want to overcomplicate it, and I feel like the snow added enough to the negative space in the sky, but they, again, just are options if you'd like to further elaborate on that. That said, it's time to start glazing, or at least it will be in about 20 minutes. I want to ensure that this is 100% fully dry. Our glaze is going to use a lot of water, and if any of that is wet at all, it's going to pick up that pigment and it's going to dilute, move what we're working with. So, we're going to let that dry. We'll head in with our glaze, and after that we can do the final beautiful little highlights. Now we're going to add 3 colors to our palette. That includes a Naples yellow, a burnt sienna, and an ultramarine blue. These are what we're using to create our glaze. We will yet again be using the 1-inch flat-headed brush. Make sure that it's nice and damp. And what it glazes is essentially a very thin layer of paint, which doesn't alter the value of the pigment much. So it doesn't change the line work, the shapes, all of that. Rather, it just adds a layer of color, or changes one if you already have one there. So with that, we are going to begin here with a tiny bit, and you really don't want much paint when you're working with glazes. We're going to grab a tiny bit of our Naples yellow, about 1/3 that in our burnt sienna. We'll mix those two together to create a nice warm glow. Then we'll grab quite a bit of water, work that into our mix to the point where it's just like watercolor. You can see it all collects. It would drip if I turned my palette sideways. And what we're going to do with this is start applying it right on the edge of our posts, but also right down the line here. Really nice and easy. We're also going to grab this, maybe a little bit more of that burnt sienna, and we can work that down here into the lit up areas. Again, need lots of water. And we'll just run this back and forth until we get to about there. Now, we need the blue. So I'm going to take all of that paint off my brush. Won't be hard because we don't actually have much paint on the brush. We'll grab our ultramarine blue, find a new clean spot on our palette. This is all fully dry, so I'll actually just use it. I'll make it nice and wet. Maybe add a hint of titanium white just to desaturate it a hint. Though titanium white is inherently a thick pigment, so we do need to ensure that we have a good amount of water. Now I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way in between and slightly on top of the edges of our gold. And you don't have to use a lot of saturation. You don't have to use a lot of pigment. I personally like to use very minimal amounts when I begin my glazes. That way I have room to build up or change my colors if I so please. I just feel like it might be better with something else. I like to keep that door open. So here we go. And again, working slightly over those beautiful golds in the background. Less so in the foreground, but I do want the edges. And I do want all of this to be not necessarily hard applications or lines. So I'm working with an X-shaped pattern to bring the blues up into the golds and the golds down into the blues. Just like so. Now we'll grab more of said blue. There's a lot of blue up in the top area in the reference photo. So we'll do this without the titanium white, at least at first. We'll get the edges of our glowing lights, but we won't actually go over the lights themselves. Feel like I have a little bit too much blue in these areas, so I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to move it to other spots. We can also make it much more malleable by just grabbing more water and adding that to the mix. There we are. No titanium white this time. Though, if you want a more subtle blue than what I currently have, you are more than welcome to incorporate it, though the white will be somewhat notable over the almost black top. So do consider that, because it will brighten the value to a point. Again, glazing doesn't do that much. Glazing predominantly focuses and changes your colors, your hues, but can change your values if it's a little bit too thick, or if you use titanium white or Mars black, just because they're so stark. Every hue, so every color, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, Naples yellow, they all, that is very blue, grabbing more water, they all have a value, right? They all have a certain amount of brightness and darkness, but it's not incredibly stark with any of them. The yellow is relatively bright, but not really for a yellow. And then the other two are fairly close to mids. It's turning out really pretty. Really, really pretty. Going to head down here, just testing that spot to make sure that it's not too wet to continue working on. Sometimes if it gets really, really wet, it won't take paint well. So you'll want to kind of just let it dry for a longer period of time. There we go. Layer number 2 coming in, looking nice. If I hold my palette up for a good couple of seconds, you will see that the paint is really starting to drip due to the excessive amount of water within it. There we go. I think the added blue in the foreground there added some nice depth. Again, not trying to do too much. Taking it one step at a time. There we are. Now, I'd like to add a little bit more of the gold, but I don't really like to work with yellows after I work with blues because they can render greens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean my brush extremely well, clean my water extremely well, then we'll come back, we'll add more to the golds, but we'll also add a bit of extra warmth to the poles via a different pigment, and we'll continue building, having fun with it. So now I've added a cadmium red medium hue to the palette, and we'll grab about half this, half our burnt sienna. Get that right there. I'm going to move a little bit of it into a clean spot on our palette, and while that spot isn't clean, it's certainly dry. I'll grab some extra water to thin it out, and I moved it just because that would be too much paint to thin out effectively. So we'll move this here, we'll grab that, and I'm going to add the extra highlight to the top and bottom of these. It's going to diversify our palette just a little bit. Orange and blue are complementary colors, so they'll help each other stand out. It'll be nice for the overall painting. We actually are yet to do the Naples yellow on the right hand side as well. So that's something we can have fun with after we've applied this. But I do want to start with this. Often we do broad those highlights on top of the darker values. Now, we'll grab a little bit more, this time mixed with just a little bit of that Naples yellow. I'll use the corner of my brush and we'll fill in some of our distant windows. See, so many areas to apply light to. Now we need to diversify them, so we'll grab more of that Naples yellow. And at this point, this isn't really that much of a glaze, just because it is actually thick paint on it, but that's okay. And we can do a little bit of a blend with our finger. It'll just give it a nice glow effect, similar to what we've previously done. And if you move too much paint off, you can always go back and reapply with a little bit of a tap here and there. Now we'll take the majority of that paint off our brush. We'll grab just that Naples yellow, move it off, thin it out. Definitely want more right here, a little bit right there, a little bit there. Not going to do too much, but we definitely increased the amount of blue we had, so we could step this up a little bit as well. There we are. By using a Naples yellow instead of a cadmium yellow or a lemon yellow, rather than a saturated yellow, we are able to work on top of a lot of these blues without getting greens. Something we should still be wary of in practice in general, but it's working out quite nicely. And now we're just blending out said yellows, which is going to make them a bit more subtle, but the image as a whole will look better. There we go. We also still need to take some of that Naples yellow, hint of our titanium white, trying to be careful not to grab the blue that's mixed in there now. Wet it a little bit. And we still need to go back and get the edges. Nice little bit of added form. Then we find these and we can apply this towards the surrounding areas. Now we'll take a step back, head back to the liner brush, grab some of that titanium white, the smallest amount of Naples yellow, and this will be our true highlight for our lights. So, with some precision and detail, we can head back into the center of these and add in a warm white, which will pop and really give the painting some magic. Not going to apply it over the entirety of the light or even the previously highlighted areas. I'm going to be very particular with it just because it is so strong, and generally with something like this we want to be quite careful. With that, we've been painting for a really long time, and I'd like to remind you that if you're watching this and you're getting ready to start the painting process, make sure that you have a little snack, a little bite to eat, that you stay hydrated during the process. That's important. It'll keep your hand a lot more steady and you just much more healthy. It's so easy to forget to do all of those things during the painting process. I know I tend to. And at this point, I'd also like to say a big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for directly supporting the channel and making longer lessons like this happen. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be able to sink the time into making these real-time lessons. You'd probably see a lot of time lapses. So Thank you for providing me with the opportunity to put these together, and for giving me just the time and leeway to do so. I actually started this painting 3 different times and then restarted because I thought of a better way to teach it. And I wouldn't be able to do that if it wasn't for you. So big thank you. This channel is predominantly community funded, and if you are new here, you can help out by heading up over to Patreon, where you can also get the traceable to help you with the drawing process, the reference photo to help you with color matching to test values and whatnot. But you can also get access to all 5 of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylics before you jump into your first acrylic painting. Bunch of ebooks full of traceables. We also have an exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their renditions of these pieces. It's always really fun to see different ideas based off of what we're working on and to gather new ideas for future works. It's also just a really supportive place. So if you're interested in any of that, go ahead and check it out. But again, big thank you to everybody who's already there, because you made this lesson happen. I always try to say a big thank you in every episode, and that will continue. Because, quite frankly, you deserve it. Thank you. Really. I love making these. And it's a real pleasure to be able to put these out. There we go. Doing some added little highlights to the actual beams right now. I don't want it to be as bright as the actual lights, which is why I'm using my finger to kind of mitigate a lot of that. And then I'm also bringing these highlights down into the actual snow, right? Because we're working with that same palette that we glazed in. And this is just going to allow us to add volume and detail in a way that we simply weren't able to do before using the other brushes. So lots of tapping and dragging right down here, really making that area come together. We can grab a bit more, head over here. I still might add the telephone lines, but I think that might be something that happens later in the week. I don't think it needs it. I think it could overcomplicate it. Just, again, looking at the photo and asking myself, how do we improve? What is necessary? What is unnecessary? And not unnecessary from the perspective of, oh, we did a good enough job, but photos are interesting in that they show you how to paint something perfectly, but the scene that is captured might not be perfect, right? Compositionally, or even just the balance of colors. So in those scenarios, you want to ask yourself, what's working, what isn't, and how you can kind of proceed in the best way possible while taking advantage of your artistic liberties. Something else I want to do is make a slightly less bright snow. Take some Mars Black, some Ultramarine Blue, a little bit of Titanium White, mix up a mid-bluish gray, bit brighter than that, and we'll add some snow to the top of our posts. Not something I noticed in the photo, but I thought could be a fun little addition to the ones in the foreground. You can barely see it. It's really subtle, but I love it. Really blends into the background. There we go. Lots of little taps and drags. It's details like that that really make a piece come together. But with that, I take a couple of steps back, and you know what I realize? I think that's it. I think that's our lesson. So, big thank you to you for being here, taking the time, creating something with me. I always really respect the fact that people do watch the entirety of these. On average, it is 13% of people who make it to the end. So if you are one of said 13%, congratulations. You are one of the dedicated few who I think will absolutely knock it out of the park. Remember, acrylics are inherently a little messy in the beginning. Oh, I have a phone call again. Sorry about that. I'm actually expecting a package of art supplies to come, which will impact our material list in the future. It's pretty exciting. I don't want to share too much about it, but at least not yet. But I think it'll be a real step in a good direction here for us. With that, again, that's the lesson. Thank you for being here. We're going to do a little code word. So if you made it this far, you can incorporate it in a comment down below, or you can just type it itself, and it's just a fun little way for me and everybody else who got this far to recognize that you are, again, one of those people who really do care. So today, I think we'll just go with streetlights. We have plenty of them here. It's a gorgeous feature. One of my favorite things to paint, actually. We do a lot of nature on the channel here, a lot of landscapes, and I love that, but there really is something that I'll always just adore about streetlights. I'll add a little highlight down here, the bottom of this roof, getting highlights from the window, soften it just a little bit. There's so many little touch-ups and things we can do. Little highlights on the tops of these where we're getting the most light. So many little things. Don't want to do too much of that, but it is a nice effect. There we go. It's hard to stop painting. I think I said the lesson was over 5 or so minutes ago, but here we are. Still going. Still enjoying ourselves. Just going to add a slight bit of highlight, making sure you can see that. To the top there. Don't want it to be too saturated. So you know what, I'll grab a little bit more white and a little bit more black. We want a brighter grayish blue. Emphasis on the gray. So we were initially just adding color via glaze, but now that we have color all over the canvas, we can just paint it on in a more traditional way. We can also continue to glaze it, but I did want to alter the value here to be a little bit brighter. So, just worked out in our favor. We can also take this and just ensure that we have a nice top in between all of those more golden areas. So many things to play with. We can also tap on some larger pieces of snow, which I only like to do at the end, but I do feel like have a good place in what we're doing. A lot of these scenes, the goal here is to not overdo it, but put in enough that the ones that you do place feel natural. So we're really jumping around. Might want to hold your brush a little bit farther back. It'll help you apply paint in a bit more of a loose fashion. And don't forget to put your snow down there as well, because it doesn't just cover the sky, it does hit the ground, and therefore visually overlap everything that we have down in this zone. Love it. Okay, there we have it. Thank you. Hope you have a wonderful time. Hope you have a wonderful holiday. I will see you again this December. Already starting to work on the next lesson. And I love this time of year. Love the scenes. And I can't wait to bring more of them to you. And something new and fun in the very early new year. So there we have it. Thank you for being here. Everybody up on Patreon, thank you for supporting the channel. If you want the traceables, ebooks, reference photos, any of that, up over there, link in the description. And I will see you soon with a brand new painting lesson. As always, stay creative.